It is 7:52 a.m. in Ottawa on Friday, July 31st, 2026. Inside the Prime Minister's office on Wellington Street, staff are finalizing a call sheet for the weekend. 19 days remain until the deadline that could rewrite the Canadian economy. Across the river in Gatineau and 1,100 kilometers south in Washington, phones are already ringing between two governments that can't agree on almost anything right now. On August 19th, 2026, a 50% tariff on a wide range of Canadian goods is scheduled to hit: wine, hockey sticks, cement, dairy, cars. That number, 50%, was not supposed to happen. 6 years ago, the United States, Canada, and Mexico signed a trade agreement built to prevent exactly this outcome. This month, Washington made a decision it hadn't made in 6 years. It chose not to renew that agreement in its current form. Here's what nobody is telling you. The headline fight over tariffs is not actually the fight that matters most this week. There's a second story buried underneath it, involving a country that isn't Canada or the United States, and a decision Mark Carney's government made back in January that Donald Trump has never let go of. We'll get to that, because once you see it, the entire tariff war reads differently. Let's start with the timeline, because the numbers only make sense in order. On July 20th, President Trump announced new 50% tariffs on a broad category of Canadian exports, effective in 30 days. The White House fact sheet cited what it called discriminatory Canadian treatment of American autos, alcohol, and dairy products. Energy, potash, fish, and critical minerals were excluded. Everything else covered by the old trade agreement was not. Prime Minister Carney called it, in a formal statement, the latest in a series of unilateral U.S. trade actions, and said it violated the trilateral agreement directly. 2 days later, he confirmed he'd spoken with Trump by phone, and both sides agreed to intensify negotiations. Now, that's signal number one, a public war of statements running in parallel with a private channel that's still open. On July 23rd, Carney flew to Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, to meet all 13 provincial and territorial leaders at once. It's called the First Ministers' Meeting, and this year it had one item on the agenda that mattered. Carney told reporters afterward that Canada has a full range of things it can do in response, but refused to name a single one publicly. It would be counterproductive at this stage to respond in advance, he said. But here's the catch. Not every leader in that room agreed with staying quiet. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has spent the meeting pushing for something sharper, reportedly floating the idea of withholding potash and oil exports entirely to, in his words, dismantle the United States' leverage. Ford has done this kind of thing before. Back in March of 2025, Ford imposed a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to Michigan, New York, and Minnesota, hitting roughly 1.5 million American customers directly in their monthly bill. He threatened to shut the power off completely if Washington escalated further. Trump responded within hours by threatening to double steel and aluminum tariffs to 50%. Ford suspended the surcharge the very next day after a call with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. That history matters because it shows exactly how fast this relationship can swing between confrontation and de-escalation. One premier's truth social baiting threat, one phone call, and the entire posture flips inside 24 hours. This time, Carney is drawing a different line than Ford wants. On July 29th in Ottawa, Carney was asked directly whether Canada should choke off oil exports as leverage. He said no. Being a reliable supplier is important, Carney told reporters. People trust us. That's internal friction, right there on live television. The hardliner premier wants economic force. The Prime Minister wants Canada's reputation as a dependable trading partner to survive whatever happens next. Now here's the domino effect, because 50% tariffs don't just sit on a spreadsheet somewhere in Washington. Canada is the single largest foreign supplier of automobiles, dairy inputs, and a long list of manufactured goods to the American market. A 50% tax on that trade doesn't get absorbed quietly by importers. It shows up in showroom prices, grocery aisles, and construction costs on both sides of the border within weeks, not months. Ontario alone builds a significant share of the vehicles that cross into Michigan and Ohio every single day. Slow that flow down with a 50% tariff. And assembly lines on the American side of that same supply chain feel it almost immediately because auto parts cross the border multiple times before a single car is finished. That's the mechanical problem sitting underneath all the political theater. Tariffs framed as punishment for Canada land, in practice, on American factories and American consumers within the same trade corridor. So why is Washington doing it anyway? That's where the second story comes in, the one we promised you at the start of this video. In January 2026, Canada announced it would reduce tariffs on some Chinese electric vehicle imports. It framed the move as compliant with existing trade rules and part of a broader push to diversify Canada's trading relationships beyond the United States. Trump did not see it that way. He threatened Canada with a full 100% tariff if Ottawa proceeded with any deal involving China. writing across social media that China was, in his words, taking over Canada. Carney's government held its ground, insisting its China policy was fully compliant with existing trade commitments. But the damage to trust was already done, weeks before the 50% tariff even became public. Here's the catch inside that catch. The trilateral trade agreement all 3 North American countries signed years ago requires a formal review roughly every 6 years. That review came due in July this month, right as the tariff war reignited. A review can mean small technical fixes. It can also mean the entire agreement gets renegotiated from scratch, or effectively left to expire. Reporting this month describes negotiations that could now stretch out for years, potentially through 2036, before a new framework is locked in. That is not a 30-day tariff dispute anymore. That is a decade-long renegotiation of how North America trades with itself, and it started because of a fight over Chinese-made electric vehicles that most Canadians weren't even paying attention to in January. So who's actually carrying the messages back and forth right now? This is where the shuttle diplomacy gets interesting. Canada's ambassador in Washington, Kirsten Hillman, sits at the center of the day-to-day channel. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc has been the government's point man on tariff files for over a year. The same Minister Ford called on to help broker the electricity ceasefire back in March of 2025. On the American side, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has repeatedly been the one who picks up the phone when a Canadian premier escalates. It was Lutnick, not Trump, who negotiated Ford down from his electricity threat in under 24 hours. That pattern has held for over a year now. Trump sets the maximalist public position. His cabinet, Lutnick especially, quietly works the practical exits with Canadian officials once the markets start reacting. Watch for that pattern again before August 19th. If a deal comes together, it likely won't be Trump and Carney announcing it jointly on a stage. It'll be Lutnick and LeBlanc or Hillman relaying language back to Ottawa that gets it across the line first. But here's the last catch, and it's the one that should worry anyone hoping this resolves quietly. Carney told reporters this week that Canada is in a stronger position than we were when this trade war started 18 months ago. That's a confident line. It's also a line that assumes Washington values a strong, unified Canadian negotiating position enough to compromise. Not every voice in Washington shares that view. And not every premier in Canada is willing to wait quietly while Carney keeps his cards close, the way Doug Ford has made clear in public more than once. If those two pressures collide, a premier moving unilaterally again, and a White House that reads any resource threat as an act of economic war, the carefully managed channel between Lutnick and LeBlanc could stop being enough to contain it. Strip away the noise, and here's where this actually stands. A 50% tariff deadline in 19 days. A 6-year trade agreement under full review, with renegotiation talks that could run into the next decade. A federal government in Ottawa trying to keep its options quiet while its most powerful premier wants to swing harder, faster. And underneath all of it, a trust problem that traces back 7 months to a decision about Chinese electric vehicles that had nothing to do with dairy, autos, or alcohol at all. So here's where the next 19 days go. Either the Lutnick-LeBlanc channel produces a framework before August 19th, something Carney can call progress, without abandoning Canada's position as a reliable supplier. Or it doesn't. And 50% tariffs land exactly as scheduled, on wine, on hockey sticks, on cement, and on every Canadian-built car crossing into Michigan that morning. Deal, or another round of tariffs. Right now, even the people carrying the messages between Ottawa and Washington aren't sure which one it's going to be.